I want to make a brief comment about the credibility of leaders and the function of public symbols as pertains especially to the current situation of Israel and the war that we're fighting. There's obviously a lot of disagreement right now in the nation about how the current issue with the return of hostages from Gaza is being handled. And I don't actually want to enter right now into the details of that deal, or whatever you want to call it, that partial capitulation. It obviously can be described in different terms depending on who is doing the describing, because others, I'm sure, can do a better job getting into the details of all of that than I would right now. But what I want to simply point out is that there's a fundamental challenge for individuals in Israeli society right now in how to view the decisions being made by leaders, that comes from the fact that so much of what might justify, at least to some degree, what leaders are doing is hidden from view. Either because they're getting intelligence reports that are top secret and we're not seeing them, and they know things that we don't know, or because there are closed door negotiations that are going on that involve different components of what's happening in the war that have to be weighed against each other. Taking, for example, the issue with the hostages, I think many people are rightly outraged and horrified that murderers with Jewish blood in their hands are being released back into the wild, so to speak, as part of the deal to save Jews who have been held captive and tortured for more than a year at this point in Gaza. And of course, everyone would love as quickly as possible to save and free all the Jews who have been held captive and tortured, and many of them also killed since the start of the war. But there's obviously a really difficult balance to strike there, in the sense that if you're going to bring about events that just lead to the murder of other Jews, then there's some question of what you're gaining, and whether you're simply just giving the enemy what he wants without getting enough in return. And so obviously that's the axis along which that debate rages. I'm not even so interested in arguing my own position in that whole discussion right now, but more to say there are many people who might look, for example, at the recent decision of Netanyahu to agree to an arrangement where some of the hostages get returned, and they might say, well, this is happening because Trump must have promised Netanyahu that if he agreed to some kind of hostage deal, then Trump would give him full backing to eliminate the Iranian nuclear program and perhaps even participate in some kind of strike on Iran. And that's an imaginable scenario. Trump wants the win for his nascent second term to be very public success associated with the start of that term, having to do with his peace through strength that he brings with his aura and his stature in global affairs. And so let's say he highly values the photo op, so to speak, of bringing some of the hostages home, even if, as many have argued, I think quite reasonably, that may consign other hostages to death in the process, and obviously in other ways really undermine Israel's security and tear away from it hard-won gains in the war that have come at the cost of many soldiers' lives. Right. So even if that's a hard thing for Israel to do, maybe for Trump, he really wants it, and maybe he's making some kind of deal with Netanyahu that Israel will get complete backing and support for what it needs to do with Iran if it agrees to this. And let's suppose that Netanyahu is then facing that choice. You might still argue, quite reasonably, from the standpoint of Torah, that it wouldn't be right of Netanyahu to make the decision to go along with, let's say, what Trump might be asking for. And, that's all very well and good, but we don't even know if that's the discussion, right? That's a speculation. All these things are speculations. So it's very hard for the people to judge their leaders when they're not privy to information that's essential for the decision making of their leaders, right? And someone like Netanyahu at the same time can always claim, well, whatever I'm doing is actually the best of all possible decisions, and you just don't know why, and you never can know why. So just trust me, right? I have your best interest at heart. If you saw the intel and if you knew the matrix of choices that I faced, you would see that I'm getting the best result for the nation, and I'm really, being just as extreme or just as zealous or just as principled as you. It's just that I'm the one who actually, sees what the real different options are. So that, I think, is the thing we have to consider how to answer a little bit, is if a leader like Netanyahu, so to speak, says that, because that is, I'm sure, part of how he would justify himself, no matter what he does. It's that, you don't know everything that I had to consider. And truth be told, as much as I'm keen to criticize various members of our government and of the Knesset and leaders of this country in many respects and for many reasons, I do consider also that they know things I don't, and there are factors affecting their decisions that I'll never be privy to. And to the degree that that's the case, it always feels a little bit kind of, armchair quarterbacking to say, oh, we really should have done such and such at this particular moment. Why didn't we, in the first week after Hezbollah started firing rockets at us, why didn't we already level Beirut, right? That's very easy for me to say. Maybe I would find myself in a different situation, and how it seemed to me if I looked at the manifest of, what our inventory of certain kinds of weapons was, and I knew how rapidly they would run out, and I knew how difficult it would be to replenish them, given, how much the Biden administration was willing to cooperate, et cetera, right? So all of those factors, even if you might disagree, you're not even part of the discussion and you don't even have access to them. And so it becomes very difficult to even know how harshly or how favorably to judge leaders because you don't entirely appreciate the choices that they face. But it would be too simple then to say, well, so just give them the benefit of the doubt. They must be doing the best they could. And who are you to say, just be quiet and sit tight and let people who know take care of things? That obviously is really dangerous and problematic, because then people can make terrible decisions as leaders and never really be held to account for it, because they can always claim, oh, well, you just didn't realize that for top secret reasons, that was the best thing that could have happened. And I think that insofar as that's the case, we're looking for a way that leaders can show that they are worthy of being trusted. And there are different aspects to this, and some of them are just, general factors in politics, and especially in democratic politics. But I think in particular in the context of Yahadut, of Judaism, it is interesting to note how the Torah and the many performances it allows us to make in public view, demonstrating our fear of God and our commitment to certain principles and certain ways of making decisions, that it provides us with all of that, and that ends up becoming a way for people in general, but especially for leaders, to establish their credibility. And I think this is even a matter in halakha. So I just have a bit of Rambam here from Mishneh Torah talking about Hilchot Edut, the laws of testimony. And there are various ways you can not qualify to be a witness in a court of law and under halakha, Jewish law. But one of them is if you're what's called a rasha, which is usually translated as being wicked. But if we just hear that word, we think, oh yeah, that makes sense. If someone's known to be a wicked person, then of course you wouldn't trust their testimony, because they're a liar. Maybe if they steal and murder, then of course they wouldn't also mind lying in court. But then when you look at the definition of this rasha, that it gets a little more complicated. So Rambam says, "Ezeu rasha kol she'avar avera shechayavin alei malkot." So who is it, this wicked person? Anyone who violates a prohibition punishable by lashes. And then when we elaborate on what that is, it starts to sound different than we might have first imagined from the word wicked. Ve'im haya hachiyuv sheba midivreim harei ze pasul midivreim. Ketzad. Achal basar behema bechalav. O she'achal nevelot shkatzim וכיוצא בהן בין לתיאבון בין להכיס, או שחילל את יום טוב הראשון, או שלבש שענז שהוא שועה או טבוי, או נוז. הרי זה פסול לעדות מן התורה. Okay, so when a person commits a transgression for which he's liable to receive lashes according to the scriptural law, he's disqualified as a witness, as we said, and it's like, what is implied? A person who ate the meat of an animal cooked in milk, or a carrion, or a crawling animal like a worm, whatever, or the like, is not acceptable as a witness according to the Torah. This applies whether he transgressed because of appetite or with the intent of angering God. The same law also applies if he desecrates the sanctity of the first day of a festival, or wears a garment that is shatnez, meaning it has mixed threads of wool and linen. And we could go on, but think about some of those things just mentioned. Basari b'chalav, like eating meat with milk, wearing garments that are linen woven together with wool. These are certainly mitzvot, they're commandments in the Torah, but they don't sound to us like things like, oh, if someone's a liar if someone's a murderer and a thief, then they're of course also going to lie, so don't trust them. This is things that are very ritual and Davka, on purpose, are being listed as kind of perpendicular, seemingly, to what we might call, ethics, and yet they still, because of the punishment that they carry in halakha, they are capable of invalidating someone as a witness, and other things as well, like shmirat Shabbat, right? If someone is not keeping kashrut, is not keeping Shabbat, then according to Rambam here in Mishneh Torah, and really he's getting this from the sages, according to the oral Torah, these are people that cannot give testimony in a court case and be trusted. And that at first seems like, well, but is that why is that a problem? If someone wears wool and linen woven together, that seems like that's not demonstrating that this person is really cruel and evil in a way where they're going to be hateful of their fellow human being and lie about other people in order to cause them harm. And yet, what we have here is the idea that yes, this is a problem, and I think this is where we have to consider why it's a problem. And I think the point is this: it's a very simple one. We're talking about the basis for credibility, right? You're gonna, as a witness, maybe you're gonna give testimony that causes someone to be punished in some way. Maybe they'll be put to death, or maybe they'll be lashed, or whatever else. But you're to be believed, and ultimately, whenever someone is a witness, the most important thing is that they have judgment and discernment at the level of some ability to tell who's doing right and wrong. And also, crucially, that they themselves have some kind of check on dishonesty, right? That they believe that they must speak the truth because of some higher principle, right? You don't want to have as a witness someone who feels no compunction about lying if it serves their own agenda. You want their agenda to be yirat shamayim, fear of heaven, right? And what halakha does, what Jewish law does, is it gives us a lot of means of demonstrating our fear of heaven in public, right? So it's true that any given thing a person might do performatively and cynically, right? They just want to fit in socially, and they just want to show other people that they're normal so that they can win them over or whatever. And of course, it's the case also that you can be a rasha within the bounds of the law. And, there's very much the concept of people who do cruel and wicked things to each other, despite the fact that they're being very careful in their observance of all the rules. But some people, because that's possible, say, oh yeah, so what do we need the rules for anyway? Let's just actually, have a very free flowing, but at the same time, internally motivated kind of decency. And obviously there's kind of a Christian critique of Judaism in that, where it's like, oh, we don't need the law. What we really need is to desire to do good. And, let's first cultivate in ourselves the desire to do good, and then we're fine. And then we don't have to worry about wearing wool and linen together. But that's not how the Torah understands it. The Torah would understand it instead by saying, look, you can, of course, do terrible things to people within the law, and you can be a bad person hiding in plain sight who keeps the law very punctiliously, at least in public. But that is difficult, right? And there will be a lot of people who will have a hard time keeping the Torah well if they don't actually care about it, right? There's so many details and there's so many different aspects of your life that that the Torah pertains to, that it really is quite a significant burden to make sure that you're doing it right with respect to Shabbat, with respect to Kashrut, and with everything else. And people who only are doing that for cynical reasons are going to have a difficult time being consistent about it, because there are so many different times it comes up, and times where maybe to some degree the Torah stands between you and what feels easy, what you might kind of more in terms of your appetites, desire immediately to do. And faking it all the time is hard. What is easier is wanting to do it, is really believing at some level that you are serving the creator of the world and this is what he wants you to do. And you draw strength to do some of these things that are sometimes not totally convenient or not totally what your appetites tell you want to do. You draw strength from understanding that he approves of you when you do the right thing, right? And by the same token, you also, in that understanding, have the idea that he disapproves when you do the wrong thing, and that he's watching, and that he knows, and he always sees. So the fact that a person does all of these things in public that have this symbolic value, each one of them seems expendable and light and easy to fake and all of that. But when you add it all up over a long stretch of time, if a person is normalized into a community where there are a lot of these observances going on, it actually is pretty hard to have a day-to-day interaction with other people who care about this stuff, and you don't care about it at all, but you're really good at faking and pretending you care all the time, and you're never sort of detected as being insincere about it. I mean, obviously, there are limits to that. There are going to be people who have figured out a way of being really good about their shatnez in their garments, but they're still really cruel and mean and unjust to people or whatever it is, right? That can happen. And so one shouldn't claim that it can't happen. One shouldn't claim that being obsessed with the punctilious observance of mitzvot is always going to make sure that you're on the right side of hayashar ve'atov, right? Doing that which is straight and good in God's eyes. That is the hardest thing at some level. But with all that being said, it is definitely the case that if someone seems to be hitting all the right notes in terms of their public observance of all of these rules, there's a good chance they care a bit about getting it right. And if that person who has, clearly in some ways limited himself and limited aspects of how he can enjoy the benefits that come to him for the sake of heaven, for the sake of serving God, and so that you see a person, and if they were totally self-serving, they would just want to grab all the toys or all the wealth or whatever for themselves, and then use it to gratify themselves in any way that they saw fit, right? If a person isn't behaving that way because it's clear that even once they get resources of some kind, they won't gratify themselves in ways that are forbidden to them, and that's clear to you, right? The more you get to see that, the more you start to think this might be a person who, really feels the eyes of HaKadosh Baruch Hu on him and really cares about doing right by HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And that's not 100%, and of course you can get that wrong, but it is useful. It's more than nothing in terms of being able to distinguish between people. And I think that's the point, right? That ultimately, when we're talking about edut, we're talking about testimony and bearing witness. What the oral law and halakha, what they're dictating is they're saying, if someone's going to come and give testimony that could, get someone else punished, possibly very severely, for their, a violation of the Torah, we want someone who appears to care about keeping the Torah properly and understands how to do that. And also, not just because then they can make a better judgment of whether the person they're testifying about is in the wrong, but also because it demonstrates that they have some yirat shamayim, that they understand the eyes of their king and creator on them at all times, and that as a result, giving testimony in a court of law about someone's violation of the Torah it's going to be, necessary to speak the truth. And at the end of the day, what we are now establishing then is that the way that people relate to mitzvot, the way they relate to public symbols, actually has a powerful function. It allows you to identify people who, maybe not with certainty, but maybe who are more likely that a random, possibly totally cynical, psychotic, or psychopathic, self-interested person, right? That a random person, more so than a random person, this person has a better chance of caring about speaking the truth in the context of testimony and doing the right thing by Hashem in general. And that's the kind of person you want weighing in when it comes to testimony. So now, if we turn back to our leaders, I think that that's true even more so, right? We're not talking about people who are bearing witness. We're talking about people who are constantly acting and making decisions that affect all of us, and they're doing it with information that they have that we're not allowed to have. They're doing it with all this discussions behind closed doors, with all of the top secret intelligence, etc., with all the clear view of what our actual means are, and things that can't be advertised, where it's like, hey everybody, we only have 2 bombs left, so let's tell you and our enemies that, and then see what people make of it. If we really only had 2 bombs left, we wouldn't want our leaders shouting from the rooftops that we only had 2 bombs left necessarily. We might want them to bluff until they got more bombs. But the point is that then when they make some decision and we look at them and they say, oh, I wanted you to, drop 10 bombs over there. And, the answer is, I did the right thing. Trust me. You need to know that it was because they didn't have enough bombs and not because someone handed them a sack of cash under the table, right? Those are the opposite extremes. But in between, you have these situations where, okay, so Netanyahu and his cabinet have agreed to this deal in which forces are deploying away from parts of Gaza in order to let Hamas take it over again so that we can release some hostages. And there are all sorts of factors and considerations that went into whether this agreement got made. And maybe it's because this way we're going to no longer be threatened by Iranian nukes, right? And that would be a different situation than if it's because Netanyahu is tired of being hated and he wants some love from some of the mob that have been hating him, in the streets for more than a year now, or really, I don't know, more than a decade, but especially more than a year now, since the war started. Or maybe it's because he can't say no to Trump because he's afraid of Trump. And so round and round you go. You can speculate about all these different scenarios for what his motivation could be. And what would reassure us that with higher likelihood he has the right motivation is partly if he could show signs that he's someone who feels constrained by his fear of heaven. And that is something I think we really do have to worry about a bit with Netanyahu. Netanyahu is, a proud Jew. He believes that it's his mission to save the Jewish people from danger. And, I think it's pretty clear that that's a sincere goal of his. Whether he believes in a God who rules the whole universe and can save us with miracles if we do the right thing, I think that's much more questionable, right? And how a leader behaves when he doesn't believe in God, when he doesn't trust in Hashem, and then thinks, well, it's all up to me, and I have to sort of beat the laws of nature and the laws of physics in order to, or let's say, I have to beat our enemies according to the laws of nature and according to the laws of physics in order for this to work. It very quickly can turn into a calculation where you don't know where the immovable lines are, right? What would he give up if he felt there was no other way? And there's a kind of leader who would say, okay, well, A, B, and C I can negotiate about and I can give up. And D, E, and F I can never give up because it's forbidden according to the Torah. And I know that means that if I refuse to give them up, that even if it seems like I'm dooming us by doing that, that HaKadosh Baruch Hu will step in and tilt the scales and save us in some way. And I can trust that that's the case, right? If you don't have that way of reasoning as a leader, then instead you pretty quickly can turn into, I will give away the farm because of my fear, right? Because I don't believe we can do better than that. And it's not even necessarily selfish always, but it can just be a kind of shortness of breath or weakness that sets in when Ain Hara, when sort of the view of negative objectivity overtakes one's sense of the matrix of choices that one faces. So I think, unfortunately, with Netanyahu, we have a lot of evidence that he's very susceptible to that. He says, for example, about Jews living in Gaza, in land that we've now conquered by spilling the blood of hundreds of Jewish soldiers, right? His position is lo reali. It's not realistic. And not only that, but he's clearly willing to move soldiers away from territory that we've conquered, that Jews died to conquer, and we just move them away in order to make some deal, right? Which is what's just happening right now. So if one could trust, for example, that he believed it was forbidden to give up the land of Israel to our enemies if we have it in our hands, as has been done over and over again in the last several decades of Land for Peace and all this sort of failed, ideologically misguided, suicidal policies since Oslo, or really since Camp David and Oslo, that have guided so much of the security posture of the country now for decades, right? If we could trust that he believed that that's forbidden by the king and creator of the world, and we have to come up with some other solution, then if he, did this or that thing that looked like it wasn't maximally aggressive at some moment, we wouldn't worry, and we'd say, okay, he's maneuvering, and then he's really, going to go for the right move, and one could give him a bit of leeway. But as it stands, there's no retreat or capitulation of that kind that I think we can be certain Netanyahu wouldn't engage in if he thought the circumstances were dire enough or the pressure was strong enough. And similarly, like with the Temple Mount, Netanyahu has, throughout his political career, loved to say about the Temple Mount, oh, well, we don't need to disrupt the status quo, and we don't need to pander to the Jewish crazies who want to do something there. He on the one hand, obviously, just to the degree that he represents a political base that is very positive about Judaism and Jewishness. It's not that he is like Moshe Dayan and thinks the Temple Mount is nothing, as something to be given away as a trinket to our enemies. Because Bibi is not a communist, and Bibi cares a lot more about Judaism as a kind of cultural treasure of his people. But at the end of the day, that's not the same thing as a leader who would say, this is our most precious and sacred national symbol, and we have to do what is necessary to secure it in our own hands, whatever the cost, and to trust that Hashem will help us make it a much easier thing to do than we might have expected. Right? He's much more the sort of person who would say, "Well, I don't want to start World War III. We don't want to inflame the entire Islamic world by reminding people that this is the holy side of Judaism and that we have a claim like no other to worship there and to exert control and sovereignty there," right? Someone like him would make the calculation, just say, what's this pile of rocks worth to me? Why would I want to bring so much more calamity down on our heads? Who even knows, right? The Abraham Accords that were heralded as bringing some new era of peace in the Middle East that has yet to really break out. When Jared Kushner, Donald Trump's Jewish son-in-law, wrote an op-ed, I think in the New York Times, heralding the achievement of the Abraham Accords when they were signed in the first Trump administration, he talked about what a wonderful thing it was that this would increase the accessibility of the Temple Mount to Muslim pilgrims from the Arabian Gulf states. And that is the kind of thinking that I don't know if it's being too gentle to say it's penny wise and pound foolish. That there's some kind of narrow gain in security that you could say that comes from certain states being your friend on paper and even to some degree with words and actions, and as a result there are fewer people who are maybe going to pose some kind of threat to you, and also there are great economic gains. And then you run things down the line a little bit, and then you think about how paralyzed you've become, because now if Jews do anything on the Temple Mount that is just a little too far, that such that it even starts to upset our allies in the United Arab Emirates, who at the end of the day are not fully aligned with Jews who want to keep the Torah on the Temple Mount with all of the associated mitzvot, all the associated commandments involving sacrifices, etc. Right? If Jews started doing those things and suddenly we jeopardized our precious peace treaty with the United Arab Emirates or whoever else, because according to their understanding, the purpose of this peace treaty was to ensure greater access to the Temple Mount for Muslim pilgrims from their country, suddenly you have multi-billion-dollar businesses that are going to be threatened because Jews are trying to keep the Torah. And suddenly you have far greater constraints on how you can handle issues pertaining to your national security, because you're walking within lines of not wanting to jeopardize these precious alliances that are supposed to be so valuable to you. So there are ways of looking at national symbols where, when you treat them like trinkets that don't matter to you, you demonstrate your general frame of mind, the way you reason, and I think Bibi has done that. It's true that symbols, in one sense, materially, in virtue of being symbols, they don't matter materially. They matter in terms of the signs that they send. And that doesn't mean that they don't matter. They actually can matter incredibly and tremendously because if you are dealing with someone who is principled enough to insist on sending the right signs with those symbols, right? People, politicians like Moshe Feiglin or Itamar Ben-Gvir about Har HaBayit, about the Temple Mount, make a point of saying we need to do certain things here, despite the reaction that it might produce, despite the political risk, etc., that might mean taking, because of the message it sends. That when you have people who choose to send that message, even though in some sense it's costing them, right, that it would be easier to do something else, you have a greater likelihood, or with greater likelihood, that they can be trusted behind closed doors or with top secret intelligence to make better decisions, or decisions better aligned with Torah. And I think that's the fundamental difficulty we have with Bibi, is that it's not that he likes to jet around Europe and eat shrimps or whatever per se, right? The problem is that in that respect, which is maybe more minor, but is ultimately equally relevant, as we saw from Rambam to testimony and Edut, or with regard to matters as big as possible, like the Temple Mount itself, like settling, conquering and settling the land of Israel. When a leader shows that he doesn't believe there's an unbreakable principle there, and that he's not bound by it, and that he can and should be pragmatic, then the question is, what is the line that he won't cross, right? Where is his sticking point, and will he get backed into a corner and driven across even that line because he's not willing to stand for the lines that Hashem has drawn? Or when he does make this or that decision, again, with information that you don't have, how far can you actually trust that this isn't about a Faustian bargain he's made up in his head, where he's convinced himself that the only way of getting A is to do B, and if you were given the same decision to make, you wouldn't, under any circumstances, consider doing A because it's forbidden by God. So that's the kind of challenge that we face in this situation. It's seemingly superficial to talk about any given one thing that a leader does or doesn't do. That's symbolic. But when you add it all up, there is an issue of how a leader is supposed to communicate to you that he's more trustworthy than a randomly chosen person, or that he will make decisions when you're not watching and you're not listening, according to the Torah that Hashem gave us, and in the way that you would want the leader to do. And I don't know if there's a solution to that in the case of Netanyahu. I think it does put us in a troubling moment because of what's going on currently, where we have to wait, every day and every week throughout this war to see, are we hanging back and are we retreating in reality, or is this part of some stratagem and really we're about to hit them even harder? And there have been moments like that. I think there was a space of time where it seemed like the government was not going to do anything about Hezbollah and was deterred and was weak. And when they finally unleashed hell in Lebanon, they really hit the enemy very hard, and made huge gains, and even much greater gains than anyone expected in terms of the ripple effects in Syria, etc. And we may be in a moment where we're poised again to do something like that. Perhaps to go after the Iranian regime and its nuclear program, perhaps to do other things in Gaza that are not what people expect once we try to get some of the hostages out and save them. But it is always troublingly the case that when you're dealing with leaders that you're not sure where their lines are and where their principles are because they have no symbols that they can use to communicate credibly to you about that. You don't really know when you're dealing with the first step in a brilliant stratagem to do the right thing, and when you're just dealing with turpitude and capitulation. So, Bezrat Hashem, we've seen already at points during the last year, our leaders show some principle and some backbone in the way that they're confronting our enemy, and may they do so again. I think every time we've seen that so far, every time there's been a bit of willingness to defy the gods of our foreign overlords, meaning the Americans and the Europeans, etc., that HaKadosh Baruch Hu opens the gates of Shemayim and gives us his love and his salvation and shows us his hand a bit. And so, maybe that's in the offing soon if our leaders show enough resolve and show enough willingness to stand for Am Yisrael and stand for Hashem instead of dancing according to the tunes of other false gods. But one way or another, that's going to be determined by these leaders. And I think we hopefully at least will learn from this era that when we ultimately have our salvation, it is coming from Hashem, and that as long as we have leaders who are reluctant to rely on Hashem and reluctant to explain their successes as coming from Hashem, we're going to always be in this muddle of not knowing how far we can trust them.